Good evening, everybody. Human rights defenders, you are not the most disciplined group of people. So good evening. It's been a long day, and from where I stand, an excellent day. Productive conversations, really provocative presentations, and now we have another one. So those who don't know me, if you haven't heard me speak, my name is Mark Anselacco. I'm Director of Research here at the Human Rights Center at the University of Dayton. And it's my pleasure to introduce Cesar Rodriguez. He's at the University of Los Andes, and I can say I was reminiscing with him 30 years ago. I think I did my doctoral research there. I haven't been back since, but hopefully I'll get an invitation after this. Cesar, we're very transactional here in Gringolandia. You know, you invite me, I'll invite you, you invite me. In your program, you have his bio, so I won't read it to you other than to say, you know, he has degrees in sociology and philosophy and law. You know, we created the Human Rights Center building on the legacy of the undergraduate program in human rights, but we had a vision to combine theory with practice, and that's contained in our statement about working at the frontiers of research and advocacy. And we've always invited to this people who, for our keynotes, people who combine this combination of scholars who are thinking in new ways, but also practitioners. So Cesar is at the University of Los Andes, a program on justice, but also has been recently named Executive Director of Dejusticia in Colombia. So he brings that combination of things. And I must say also, when we had the first Social Practice Human Rights Conference in 2013, one of the themes was, one of the findings, if you were, one of the main themes of our conversations was that the global human rights movement has undergone a dramatic change with the shift of the global south, with dynamic human rights movements in the global south beginning to reset the agenda. And so we knew that henceforth we would need to invite people from the global south to lead this. And when we weren't even completed in 2013 when we started thinking about a keynote speaker, and several people immediately suggested that it should be Cesar. And so we've invited him. And with that, I'm just going to invite him to stage to listen. He's got a presentation on amphibious rights. I just want to understand what that's going to be. But please welcome me, join me in welcoming Cesar Rodriguez from Dejusticia.
Thank you, Mark, and thanks to the center, Yusef, Monty, everyone who made this possible. I don't know whether I'm going to live up to those expectations. Certainly not this late at night. I was telling Mark that I'm a morning person. I wake up at 4:30 in the morning, bike around Bogota, and certainly at this time of the day, I usually tune out. So if I'm tuning out and I do a lousy job, you will know why it is. But I'll do my best. And I also work with a group of designers who do this type of presentations with me. I've been doing this for a few years, and I found out that they help me keep awake the audience and myself. So hopefully the animation here and the presentation that you'll see will be also that kind of device that will play the role of an alarm clock, right, in case this is getting too slow. But actually, I think I'm going to hold up and actually going to be energized through the conversation here, because I usually feel on the minority, both in scholarly and in activist circles. And in scholarly circles, because I got my PhD not far from here at Wisconsin sociology, but back then, 10 years ago, I would be traveling back and forth between Wisconsin and Bogota, very different places. And the reason is that back then we were founding Dejusticia, which has grown to be a 50-plus researcher, activist organization that's been doing interesting work on human rights, which is that experience along with my work at Los Andes, so I split my time between academia and activism quite literally, has fueled the type of practice that I'm gonna talk about today. So instead of focusing on a topic, which is something that we had discussed with Mark when he first kindly invited me, I was gonna talk about precisely this shift of activism, of ideas, of networks to the Global South, which is what I wrote about in a paper that you might be interested in looking at that came out in a Brazilian human rights fantastic journal by the name of Sur, South, last year. I decided not to do that, although I'll say something by way of preface on what I see as the context of the human rights movement and of human rights scholarship these days. But instead of doing that, I thought I would tackle head-on this challenge of combining research and scholarship, which lies at the center, at the heart of what this center does, right? So, and this is the talk with many modifications, amendments, extensions that I give to the group of activist scholars from the Global South that come to Colombia every year for 10 days for a workshop that I'll show you a video about. And basically what I'm gonna do today and what I try to do in that workshop along with a group of excellent colleagues at Dejusticia is to legitimize and to make sense of that circulation between activism and academia. Because, and I have a paper about this in which I say that doing action research is like leading a double life, right? You have to live in academia by the standards of academia, and they want you, I don't know, of course, this happens also in universities like this one, but certainly even more so and with more pressure in other universities, they want you to publish in specific outlets, to go by specific rules that make it almost impossible to be relevant and to be active outside of the ivory tower. So I've had to lead that double life, and part of what I've considered sort of my life's mission is to make it easier for other people not to have to lead that double life, but integrate those two people into one, the activist and the scholar. And I think that in order to do, for that to be possible, we need to do some theoretical work, but also some practical work in which you legitimize and show that that's possible and that what happens outside of the ivory tower becomes relevant and useful to teaching and research, and vice versa, because there's a lot of resistance also on the activist side, oftentimes with regards to what happens in academia. So my argument from the other side is that we in the human rights community, and you will see that I'll talk about we distinctly from academia and from NGOs and activist circles, we in the activist world will need to appreciate what academia and quality research can contribute to reflexivity and to more impactful human rights practice. Right? So this is my mission today in this talk. But before launching into the actual presentation of what I think is action research and how it's practiced and how it can be legitimized and extended in a way that can help the cause of human rights around the world, let me say a couple words about the context that I'm talking about. This is the Sur journal part of my presentation. And I'll begin by referring to an anecdote that comes from a big meeting of human rights NGO leaders that the Ford Foundation convened last year in Marrakesh, in March or April of last year. So the heads of around 30 human rights organizations, all the way from Human Rights Watch and Amnesty to Dejusticia, Connect Us in Brazil, Kenya Human Rights Commission in Kenya, Forum Asia, leading organizations from around the world got together for 3 days to brainstorm about the future of human rights. So as you can imagine, it's not an easy meeting to facilitate because we all are used to fighting difficult fights. So in order for us to be able to sit down and relax for 3 days and brainstorm about the situation, it took fantastic facilitation, but I think that's been one of the most productive meetings that I've ever attended. But the conclusion for me and for many other people that I talked to, is that we had no idea where we were going. And this is not a hopeless conclusion. Actually, it was quite humbling. And in the words of great activist from Witness, the video advocacy organization, Sam Gregory, he said that there were too many changes coming at us at full speed, right? So in the Sur article, I highlight 3 types of changes, the structural changes that we all know about, but are rarely talked about in conjunction with one another in human rights circles. The first one, of course, is the rise of a much more multipolar world. The fact, well, the evidence from the business and human rights treaty process, or the difficulty of coming to an agreement on climate change, they all are signs that the old way of doing things, right, of the US and European powers coming together and deciding on a human rights treaty or an approach to human rights, that's no longer possible. For good and for bad reasons. I mostly see that as a hopeful development, because I would like to see a much more participatory, horizontal, cosmopolitan human rights international framework and movement. But it is true that it also makes a lot difficult collective action on human rights, both on the state, on the state side, but on the hopeful side of this, it pushes us in the North and the South to work together more often. So I was talking to many of you over lunch and in the panels, and we all realized that we need to work across this North-South divide, which still is pretty overwhelming and pervasive. We've talked with Mona. I remember having this conversation last year about funding trends and funding flows. There's still asymmetries of funding sources and funding recipients across the North and the South. There's, of course, a big difference between the level of influence and the level of attention that, say, northern media outlets give to northern-based organizations opposed to southern-based organizations. But multipolarity in general, I think, has brought up a number of challenges that call for creative thinking and advocacy. I'll go through the other changes very quickly because I want to get to action research in a minute. Second change, structural change, of course, is technology, ICTs, and the fact that many individual citizens these days call themselves and do not ask for permission to call themselves human rights activists. So they do not need to have a law degree. They do not have to have the permission of organizations, professional organizations like Dejusticia or Conectas or Kenya Human Rights Commission in order to be active in human rights and to make a difference, oftentimes more so than the professional organizations. And the final one has to do with this erosion, which I see definitely as a positive development, of legal thinking and of legal tools as privileged strategies in human rights work. I was trained as a lawyer, I still litigate, I do that very often, but I also am quite aware of the defensiveness of lawyers and the dominance of lawyers and legal thinking in human rights language and advocacy. And I think that's been challenged very effectively by all kinds of professionals, of all kinds of people from different quarters. Again, all the way from e-activists to social scientists, artists, video advocates that have enriched and enlarged the human rights field. So the aggregate result of these changes and many others that I'm sure you can come up with is that, to put it in Nancy Fraser's terms, the what, the how, and the who of global justice and human rights is up for grabs. The what, and this hasn't happened for a while. If you have read Stephen Hapgood's book, provocative book on the end times of human rights, I think I wrote a critical blog on his work that I think that taken with a huge block of salt, that book does strike some interesting and painful nerves of blind spots, of asymmetries, of voids in the international human rights world, both in academia and in practice. So the aggregate result is that what rights and what issues count as strategic human rights issues is up for grabs. So not the old, for example, not the old debate about whether or not socioeconomic rights are human rights at all. Quite frankly, that's your problem, right? So that doesn't happen outside of the U.S., right? So that's outside of the U.S. and when Human Rights Watch back in the 1990s used to say that, well, you're overextending the human rights agenda. Like the rest of the world, quite frankly, didn't pay attention for good reasons because we already had constitutional clauses on human rights in constitutions like the South African of 1994, Colombia 1991, Brazil 1988, and we continued forging ahead with those clauses, and now it's been sort of global North organizations like Amnesty, thankfully, that embrace that agenda. Now, the risk is that they give sometimes the impression like they were the ones who pioneered the socioeconomic rights advocacy approach, but that's a different problem. But what rights? Think about, we were talking about disability rights, right? Rights of migrants, rights of the LGBT community, but also very, pretty classic issues like civil liberties that have, just for example, in Latin America, in my own region, just when we thought that we had solved that problem, right? We're back to issues of judicial independence, of torture, of political imprisonment in many countries. We published last year a pretty tough report based on research on the ground on Ecuador, on the lack of political freedom and the lack of freedom of expression in Ecuador, right? And what you find is not exactly, of course, not by any stretch of the imagination, close to the types of violations that we would see in the 1970s in dictatorships in Latin America, but still pretty serious violations of basic human rights. And those violations cut across governments of the left and the right. And who counts as a human rights actor? So the who is also up for grabs. As I said, there is this tendency to erode the monopoly over the role of human rights activists that lawyers and professionals have had. And finally, and interestingly, the how. The how. A friend of ours, many people here, I realized have worked with a dear friend of mine, Catherine Sicking, who with Margaret Keck, of course, wrote this seminal work on transnational advocacy networks. Just recently, we had a workshop at Brown University assessing and celebrating the 15th anniversary of that publication of that book. We were 2 years late for that anniversary because it was actually published in 1998, but we held the conference this year. And one of the things that we discussed with Margaret and with Catherine and many activists from the North and the South is that that boomerang model continues to be around, continues to be used, but there are many other strategies that do not necessarily follow that boomerang model, right? Among other things, because it's no longer as effective to go to Washington or to Geneva to make progress on your cause in Colombia or in Kenya or in Thailand. So why do I mention this context? Because I think that precisely the confusion, you can see this as a half glass full or half glass, or glass half empty, half full type of situation in which you say, well, there's chaos, there's confusion, and there is both, right? So this is what I took away from the Marrakesh meeting, that no one from the big and established and wonderful organizations that have been around for 30, 40 years, like Amnesty, that's, as you all know, moving closer to the ground, doing what I think is an interesting job of trying to get closer precisely to those sites of power, to the sites where human rights work and violations are happening. But that's a work in progress. I don't think that Amnesty has figured that out, and they don't say, they're quite frank about that. Likewise with the Human Rights Watches opening offices around the Global South. And likewise with those organizations like Dejusticia that are based in Global South are trying to figure out exactly what world we'll be operating in, right? And it's unclear. I tend to see those situations as with optimism, and to take Thomas Kuhn's work, well, that's when in those moments of paradigmatic shifts moments where you're moving from one paradigm to another, from unipolarity or bipolarity to multipolarity, from law-centered strategies to more diverse strategies, from analog strategies to digital strategies. That's when creativity and reflexivity are most needed. And that's why this is a long way to justify the need for action research, which is what I'm going to talk about in the rest of my presentation with the help of these windmills, right? So I'm going to go through, I have an article where I call this the action research windmill, and I'll explain why the windmill. Right? I take this idea of the windmill from a wonderful article by a Berkeley sociologist by the name of Michael Borawoy. He's a great ethnographer, but he's actually writing about a South African human rights activist and scholar by the name of Eddie Webster, who used to be the head of SWAP, a research center and a human rights NGO based or embedded in Wits University in Joburg. Actually, Eddie Webster was one of the key white academics who consistently opposed apartheid, and as a result, along with many other scholars, well, he was persecuted and threatened by the apartheid regime. And Michael Borawoy calls Eddie Webster the sociological windmill, right? And why the windmill? I'll show you why the windmill. So I adapt this metaphor to human rights. I'm a sociologist, but here I'm putting on my human rights defenders and scholars hat. And he says that the windmill, Michael says about Eddie's work, that the windmill has 4 arms, right? Doing action research is doing 4 things. First one, of course, is doing research. You have to have a research agenda, right? Research agenda that's more or less long-term, that is not just done for an op-ed. I write an op-ed for a Colombian newspaper every week, and I do a mini research for that particular text, but that doesn't count as a research agenda. Research agenda, of course, we all know, takes more time and effort than that. But that's key. Second one is public engagement. And this is where action research starts to differ from conventional research. So you engage with many other publics. You need to learn, and you do learn, to speak to not just to the media, which is kind of the constituency that you usually think of when we think of public engagement, but also with government officials, with social leaders, with international funders, and I'm looking at Mona here, inevitably. Where you need to, you learn to talk to also quite different constituencies, like other NGOs, NGO leaders, NGO staff, people who work on issues and with strategies that are quite different from yours. And that seems and looks and sounds more fashionable than it is, but it actually entails lots of meetings, right? So that's how you do public engagement. Then policy work, and this is more specific. The idea of converting, of trying to make your research usable for legislation, for constitutional amendments. We're in the process of amending the Colombian Constitution, hopefully, in order to accommodate the results of the peace negotiations with the oldest guerrilla group in the world, FARC. And this is what we're doing at Dejusticia, producing ideas in columns, in policy papers that might hopefully illuminate the process of fashioning a transitional justice mechanism and a set of rules that will strike a balance between peace and justice, right? So it will be the first such mechanism, the first such system in a peace process under the purview and under the rules of the Rome Statute. And finally, institution building. And this is the most tiring and less fashionable type of work, which is, well, you need to fundraise, you need to figure out how to create an organization and run an organization that reflects the values that you're fighting for, right? That do not exploit people, right, that pay decent salaries, that runs in a relatively participatory way, and that's like running any organization, but with the complication that we care even more about the values of that organization. But now, this is the windmill part. So the interesting part is that what makes action research unique, or this particular hybrid, is not any of the arms, but actually the rotation and the constant interaction of these four arms. And this is why Michael Boravoy says that when he's close to Eddie Webster in South Africa, he feels like he's in a vortex. Right? This is what I really loved about that article when I first read it. Because I said, well, I had used that term to describe my own work and my own feeling about doing action research. Because I said, well, this is like a hurricane sucked you into some sort of insurmountable force, and you're constantly running from one place to another because the events change all the time, because you're trying to reach out to different constituencies and so on and so forth. So it's this type of dynamism that's quite exhilarating, but it's also exhausting. I'll go through this very quickly. These are just some samples from our work, but I'm sure that many of you do the similar type of work, so I won't change it. This is simply the idea of translating an academic article. This is an actual example, an article that I published on indigenous people's rights in Latin America that got constantly sort of refashioned into the ideas there, into op-eds, into press coverage, so that we could hopefully reach out and to other audiences. Then policy work and legal advocacy. I'll go through this very quickly. Institution building and communications, because I want to get to the advantages and the challenges of doing action research. I don't have a slide on the advantages, but before I get into the complications and the difficult part of this story, because it's not all about potential and advantages and achievements, but it's also about dilemmas, which is something that I really want to discuss here. But before doing that, as I do in the paper, I want to discuss briefly the advantages of doing action research. I think there are at least three big strengths of this type of work. One, in research terms, I feel strongly that the type of academic research that comes out of this engagement is much more empirically rich and accurate. Because what it entails is that you're very close to the ground, literally close to the ground, working with your counterparts, communities or NGOs, government officials for a long time, much longer than the usual fieldwork period of any academic scholar. Because, by the way, you cannot choose to leave whenever you want. Right? I was struck recently, well, last year, by a conversation I had at a Law and Society meeting, a professional meeting last year in Minneapolis with a great scholar who wrote a fantastic book that had elicited quite a bit of attention and interest from human rights practitioners. And when I asked him, well, are you going to produce sort of something, are you going to continue working along those lines? And he said, no, I moved on. I moved on to my next book, right? Which is perfectly sensible from an academic point of view, right? He has to deliver the next book for his tenure track position, or he's already tenured, so he's got different types of prestige pressures, but he can choose to move on and basically leave that research behind and say, well, I'm no longer interested in that line of work. So if you're interested, he would say, if you're interested in my new topic, then I'll talk to you and I'll devote time to talking to the activists that are interested in that topic. But I will not engage anymore with people who are interested in my previous book or in my previous work, right? But that's very hard to do. That's actually impossible to do for a human rights activist, as we all know, because you develop ties of trust, types of solidarity that are impossible to break overnight. But it also results in empirical accuracy and richness. Second advantage that I want to highlight quickly is, of course, relevance. The type of writing that you do the type of research that you produce has a better chance of being actually usable on time. We were talking with Bert about the publication cycles in academic circles. Well, for good reasons, but for reasons that have to do with academic incentives, publication cycles are very, very long. So when your research is actually out, well, the problem has been either solved or it's a mess, right? So if I chose to write about transitional justice in Colombia just for a publication outlet in academia, that probably the article would come out, if I'm lucky, in 2 or 3 years. In 2 or 3 years, the whole implementation process of the peace agreements will be over. So that type of relevance has to do with timing, but also with the content and the language in which action research tends to be produced is also an advantage. And finally, one that's not often talked about, which is motivation. Oftentimes, the problem that I have, and many of us have in academia with bright students who spend many years, I certainly saw this, and I was close to suffering the same type of depression cycles in grad school, is that, of course, you wonder what exactly you're doing, right? What is it that you're working so hard for, right? Why 7 years in a PhD program, right? And that question actually makes a lot of sense as soon as you step out of academia, right? So as soon as someone from the outside asked it. One thing that I have found with my own students and the researchers at Dejusticia is that when you incorporate systematically an action component to research, then people are re-energized, right? Because they're engaged with actual practice. And that when that feeds into quality research, then you can get this type of virtuous circle that the windmill idea portrays. But of course, this is not all perfect. In fact, it's quite hard and quite challenging. And I wanted to be sort of quite explicit, and this is why my next slide has to do with this question. Whether or not doing action research is a quixotic enterprise. If you've read about, or even better, if you've read Don Quixote, you know that Don Quixote is this, wannabe knight, right, who read too many medieval books about, what do you call this? Well, knights who, liberated beautiful ladies and fought for justice. But in that book, of course, the idea is that he's kind of a dreamer, right? He's delusional because he mistakes the windmills for giants, right? So he thinks that he's fighting giants when he's actually fighting those windmills in the Spanish countryside, right? And but the idea is, is this possible, or is this delusional? And I want to just mention 4 risks and challenges of doing action research. First one is dispersion. Of course, when you have to run between, a founder's office and a field work in one of the most dangerous, tricky places in your own country, then you have to go to a meeting with the government and so on and so forth. Your attention is all over the place. I mean, talk about multitasking. That action research did that well before the invention of social media. So dispersion. And with that comes the risk of academic dilettantism, right? The quality of research might suffer. And this is something that I think many in the human rights community are taking more and more seriously. The fact that we need to make sure that the quality of the research that's produced inside human rights organizations is of high quality so that it can be validated. And that's where organizations like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty are great, right? And they have professional journalists and they have actual professional academics in their staff trying to constantly keep the standards of their research to the highest level. Quickly here, dependence, right? That being so close to different constituencies creates a risk of becoming sort of an appendix of those different constituencies. The frontier, the line between a human rights scholar and a human rights consultant I've seen this up close because of the topics I work on lately, for, say, a mining company, that ask you, well, would you be my community advisor for this FPIC, free prior informed consultation process with this indigenous community, given that you have already worked for that community, with that community, and you know the community, and you know the leaders, and you can provide advice. That's happening more and more, at least from where I see this, in the business and human rights field, because it's become kind of an industry, right? Become this hot topic. Everyone wants to get into business and human rights. All the organizations, all the human rights organizations, all the research centers, funders are big on business and human rights. So an industry has developed as a result. And you never know how independent the analysts are, where their allegiances are. Regardless of the sides that people take, what I want to highlight here is the fact that from an academic point of view, from a research point of view, there is the constant risk of losing perspective, of becoming too attached and basically part of an organization or a corporation's a group of advisors, as opposed to someone who can take some distance and gives relatively independent advice. And finally, this is the more existential dilemma, which is burnout. Right? What action researchers and activists that we work with complain all the time about is that the same type of motivation that makes them work harder and harder, well, leads to burnout. And this is an epidemic in the human rights movement and in the human rights and action research world. People are overworked for good reasons, but still I think it's something that needs to be taken into account. And this also can amount to a disaster, right? So this is the possibility of this leading to Don Quixote being defeated and retreating in defeat, right? But you may have anticipated this is not how this sequence ends, because as I mentioned, I tend to be an optimist, and so at the optimistic point of view, and this is the last part of that paper that I mentioned about amphibious research, and this is where I would like to, what I would like to devote the rest of my presentation to and the conversation with you all, is how to make this sustainable, right? How to create a different type of windmill, different types of channels that allow people, especially I'm thinking of younger scholars, activists, to circulate between those two worlds, to make that combination, right? What I'll show you in the other couple of windmills up here, the icons, are just some specific examples that I've been involved in, practices and pilot projects that I've been involved in which we have been trying to develop specific venues and sites and types of careers whereby some of these dilemmas at least can be mitigated. Not completely solved, but at least mitigated. And again, and this is, I promise this is the last windmill, no more windmills here, is, well, methodologies. Right? We in the academic world, in social science, for instance, have a wealth of qualitative research methods that are closely related to methods and techniques that are used in human rights documentation and reporting, right? All the way from ethnography, from structural interviews, from participant observation. But they tend to be practiced in a very specialized way. So if you do sociology, you do ethnography in a certain way. If you do anthropology, that's a different world. And if you do human rights research, then you're supposed to follow yet another set of guidelines that you learn through training processes or training programs with organizations that are specialized in that type of human rights documentation work. So the idea here and the hope would be that we could take from different sets of tools and methodologies to develop something that would approach a human rights method or sets of methods that can be used more systematically in practice as well as in academia. Second, quickly, writing styles. One of the most painful and difficult things that make action research hard to do is that you're supposed to write in completely different genres in academia as opposed to journalism. So you're supposed to start with your theory, then follow your methods, then the evidence, then the conclusions, right? No one will ever publish such a paper in a newspaper or even in a blog, right? So my pitch here is to train human rights activist scholars in writing styles that will work in both worlds, right? And this is actually something more of an uphill struggle in academia than outside of academia, because it means legitimizing, validating writing styles within academia that are not necessarily the format, the conventional format that you need to use in order to publish in the article, in the journal that you need to publish in order to get tenured or to get or to graduate from a PhD program with success, right? I'll end in a moment with a couple of concrete examples, but for now I'll finish the general discussion here. This is a related potential avenue, outputs. The question is whether the problem with the double life of the academic on the one hand and the activist on the other hand is that you're supposed also to produce in formats, not just languages and writing styles that are quite different from each other. So if you're an activist, you're supposed to, for example, do popular education programs, run workshops for communities that are, for example, that are litigating a case, and you need to bring them up to speed with the legal strategy that you're working on for them, or with them, right? Whereas in academia, well, you're supposed to create a curriculum for your master's program, for your undergraduate minor, and those tend to be completely different exercises, right? Because the bibliography you use for the master's program course doesn't quite work for the popular education work. So the idea here is to use some formats that are not necessarily written formats that can circulate across those two worlds. And I'll say in a moment what I mean by that. And finally, translation. And I mean here not just linguistic translation from Spanish to English or vice versa or from any other language, but legitimizing the role of activist scholars as potential translators between those two worlds. People who facilitate that circulation, who make it easy, for instance, for a master's student or a law student or a social science student to do an internship at an NGO, but also for an NGO staff person to go and get some room for maneuver and some time for reflection at a university, right? And so institutionally, it's important to create those mechanisms for translating what makes sense in academia, administratively, and what makes sense in an NGO or a community or grassroots organization. So this is my more relaxed and hopeful, that's why it's green, windmill. And I'll show you what I mean by this in a couple of examples. This is the workshop that we do at Dejusticia every year. It's pretty self-explanatory, so I won't say anything. This is the temptation, of course, of both academics and activists to tell you the story instead of telling, instead of showing. So I'll just show you. This is a workshop, or an action research workshop that we do every year with about 15 action researchers from the Global South. Okay.
útil investigaciones de adicción. Es muy útil porque realmente nos va a llevar a poner en práctica todos esos derechos que aprendemos, todo lo que la academia nos enseña, lo que a los activistas a veces les falta, por ejemplo, para poder saber los tribunales o hablar con los políticos de un igual a igual. Y saber que estamos entendiendo lo que están diciendo, comprendemos efectivamente cuáles son nuestros derechos y que los vamos a poner en práctica.
Action research is absolutely important. We are always on the run. We are always bringing up issues. But then it's very important to document these and again, do some form of research to establish the validity of some of the methods that we use in collecting our data.
Este taller ha sido útil en muchos sentidos. Por un lado, apromorar habilidades relacionadas a la escritura, la capacidad de comunicar, pero también el taller ha sido útil para compartir experiencias muy valiosas con la gente que está acá, que vino de varias partes del mundo.
I learned how to do research, how to substantiate my work with details and with information that's credible and valid and can be presented in whatever audience.
Eu acho que é importantíssima essa colaboração Sul-Sul em relação a direitos humanos, porque esta região está vivendo problemas muito parecidos. Então, uma coisa que está acontecendo hoje em um país dessa região pode também, e muitas vezes está acontecendo em outro. Eles estão enfrentando os mesmos problemas.
Eu penso que nuestra responsabilidad es esta, es producir trabajo científico, teórico, analítico e empírico, valorando sus saberes, produzindo lo que eu llamo uma ecologia de saberes, entre o saber acadêmico e o saber popular.
Ese es el gran valor agregado que tiene Dejusticia haciendo estos talleres y reuniendo a gente tan diversa, pero que puede consolidar a Dejusticia como una nueva forma de relatar los derechos humanos, no solo en Colombia, sino a nivel global.
See this? This is last year's workshop, and I realize it's more promotional than I would have hoped. So if you remove the plug for Dejusticia, it's just the key thing is to understand what the dynamic is. It's 10 days. We do training in research methods, like advanced training in research methods, in creative writing, and finally in communications. And the output, I'll show this very quickly. I won't go into details because I'd rather, of course, leave time for questions and discussion. Is, as I said, this is all images from the workshop that I want. This year, it was on transitional justice. So this is from last year, human rights and environmental justice. This is what was explained in the video, but I want to get to the final sequence in this little slide, which is this. So the challenge is that those 10 days can be exhilarating, very exciting, and people get very close to each other, and we have a wonderful time, and people do learn. We've been, fine-tuning the workshop. It wasn't that successful the first year, but it's been improving. But then, if they go back to the organizations, they will be immediately absorbed by the daily demands of activism, right? So the key thing that we've learned is that you need to keep them, to remain them, to keep them engaged. And in order to do that, you have to tutor them for at least an additional year. So what we do is they have a dedicated tutor for 1 year that help them develop the writing project that they submitted in order to get accepted into the project. And this year, happily, this is all students from around the global south, Asia, Latin America, Africa. This is from last year's countries. But what I want to get to is this. So they all became the authors of this book. and the tutors are professional academics. I mean, they're not human rights activists. One of them was Michael Boraboy, he was the president of the International Sociological Association until last year. These are top academics. This year, Catherine Seeking was one of our faculty. And these activists became the authors of the case studies and of the chapters on their own practice, right? As opposed to having someone from professional academia parachute in, do the research and write about what these people had been doing for years. So that's the larger goal. And one thing that we have been particularly encouraged by is that once they finished their chapter, they say, well, what now? Are we going to go back to daily grinding of their usual work? And they created this blog, which is called Amphibious Accounts. As you can imagine, well, Amphibious is the way that I have, the term that I have used to try to use a metaphor to explain this type of hybrid practice, right? So amphibious is in that just as a frog is able to transit from water to the surface and breathe both in air and water, that these young researchers, activists can be functional in both academia and in actual human rights work. And I'll end with this, which is just a more recent example that I won't have time to explain, but I'll be happy to share with you in more detail in the hallways tomorrow. Through this process of fine-tuning, we realized that the young activist researchers are quite frustrated with the conventional ways in which activism is done in their NGOs. Right? They say, well, we do not innovate enough. Right? We're doing the same strategies that the founders of organizations used to do. And we all know that the human rights movement is quite, despite the fact that, or the professional human rights movement, despite the fact that we go supposedly against the structures, are quite conservative about the strategies that we ourselves use, right? And that, again, our fault, a professional fault, lawyers have been part of that defensiveness as well. So more recently, with our group of organizations, we created what we call the Human Rights Lab, precisely to create this space for experimentation, in which, and this is not new, of course, the lab and the design thinking methodology has been used in many other quarters, but but less often in human rights. So we start, and this is the first lab we did this year. This is March in Bogota. We start with a big problem. The problem here was precisely human rights training, how to improve and how to innovate in human rights training, both in academia and in human rights organizations. So we start by diagnosing a big problem. Then there is a process, you might recognize some faces there. Then there's a process with a professional facilitator here, of going through a fast-paced process of 2 days, in which actually in small groups you tackle a specific problem. How do you improve? How do you incorporate ICTs into a master's program at your university? Or how do you get your activists in the organization that you lead to do better quality research, and so on and so forth? But then this is the part that I found personally more exciting and innovative, is that after the 2 days, you actually come out of those labs with a prototype solution. It's not like, you would do in 2 days what usually would take 2 years to the same people to come up with, just because of the pace of our usual work. And then, and this is the step that with this community of people who attended this lab, we're at this moment, which is trying to figure out, of those ideas that we produced in 2 days, which ones are more promising, what the people in design thinking call most viable prototypes. In the hope that we will choose 1 or 2 that we'll be able to incorporate in our own training programs inside and outside academia. I think I'll leave it at that and open it up at least briefly for questions and reactions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that presentation. I really enjoyed what you had to say. In part because it took me back to the time I had an institute which was working on environmental rights in Pakistan, and we were constantly faced with this tension that you have very elegantly outlined. But I did have a feeling a little bit that there was a certain amount of defensiveness in your presentation. And by defensiveness, what I mean is, we know that academia is a very respected profession, but so is activism, certainly where I come from. Why is there a need to be something other than what you are? I mean, in a sense, we can say that activism has its own rules and its own structures. And certainly when I was talking to my colleagues and my younger colleagues, one of the things I would say to them is that as activists, one of the things we need is that people should trust us. And that's what we need from academia, that academia is a profession that actually forces you to try to be honest, to look at the numbers, to look at the data and so forth. And I said, that's what we need from academia and nothing more. Because everything else is that we are here trying to solve problems, to bring attention around people, trying to build capacity. And I want to put this question to you. Is it really a question of being amphibious, or is it a question of being comfortable in your own skin and taking what you need from academia and what you need from other professions or other pursuits as you need them? I hope I'm making myself clear.
Yeah,
I mean,
sure.
there is there does even amphibiousness suggests that there's a need to be something other than what you are, and is that really necessary? Thank you.
We take more questions. Yeah, I think I'll take a couple if there are more, and then react. Yeah.
So I think I've actually seen you give a version of this before. It's bringing back memories of action research conferences. And I guess I was curious to hear you talk about where has this been most challenging to implement? Where do you get the pushback? Like with the lab, which sounds great, and yet we've been doing some design research and human-centered design projects, and it's very uncomfortable for many people. So wondering, where have you found the resistance?
Thank you. This was a very, very moving speech. To kind of answer maybe that one question or where the push may be coming from, as a young scholar, I'm a PhD student at University of Washington. I mean, this is both very inspiring to listen to. On the other hand, I'm still thinking like, well, I've got to publish, I've got to get a job, I've got to get a tenure. And in order to be able to do this kind of action research, you need to be training young scholars like myself. Because after you get tenure, you're already way into the system. You're already thinking in a very different way that I think it's almost impossible to think. And I'm trying to do both activism. I'm from Turkey, and I'm trying to do activism work there, and I'm trying to stick to academia here, and I still find it very difficult. I mean, it would be great to have these skills of, learning how to write outside of academia, but it took me 5 years to write academic articles to be able to publish. And I don't know how much time and resources I have. And just over dinner, I was talking to some other young scholars who were, we were just sharing stories of how graduate students were going on strikes at our universities because we don't get enough funding to even support ourselves. So where do we get the funding and the research, resources to be able to commit ourselves to this kind of research? So there may be one kind of push to this. Thank you.
Hi, kind of to echo what she just said and maybe to answer some of your questions as well. I think there's an issue too as, why can't you just be comfortable in your own skin? We're trying to straddle those lines as an academia and an activism. I felt like I have to do one first and then learn the other. And maybe if there was a way that you could rise up from the, from being a high school student and learning both of those at the same time, then there would be a more natural flow to that. Because, having just graduated from law school and being in crippling debt and, being interested in the academic side as well, like there's a pushback for me because, how do I break into that sector while, keeping everything else managed, and just the general structural issues, I think, in the United States with, the cost of education and things like that, it makes it very hard for even young scholars or young activists to decide which one to do first and how to break into the second one while still trying to establish yourself in the first.
Okay. Thank you for those very difficult questions, and they're difficult because they entail existential challenges, right? And some of them happen at the personal level, but they have institutional roots, like the ones that you both are mentioning. But also, there are some resistances and pushbacks coming from the structure of the field. So I guess I'll first try to answer your question, so in the order that they were asked. The first one, when you said that I was defensive in my presentation, then I realized that you were defending the existing frontiers of the fields, and I would agree with your defense. My pitch is for them not to be as orthodox as they are, that those frontiers be more porous, and that they allow some circulation and some transit, but for people who stay there full-time, I think that's the core of those fields and that activity. We of course need full-time academics, and we need full-time activists, and actually because of those existential problems, I think that most people would probably be better advised to stay within those borders, and both for the personal health, but also for the health of those fields. Now, what I'm suggesting here is that there be something in the interstices at the margins, and that those be recognized as opposed to challenged and harassed. And that's exactly so the type of intermediate space that I'm trying to discuss here. But I would absolutely agree with you that we need healthy, strong academic and activist fields that can be recognized as such in personal and in organizational and in field level trajectories. That's an excellent question. I can give you many examples, but I'll give you just a couple examples from this recent lab. The first pushback has to do with the pace, with speed. Right? People find this too fast. Right? Many people, not the majority of the group, we were 30 people from different disciplines, from different types of NGOs, from funding organizations, that you have seen in the pictures. And so the majority went along with it, and I think it was quite successful and quite productive and quite congenial. But there were a number of voices that complained about this being too fast-paced, right? That we need more time to think through these issues, right? That human rights issues are complex. They're really hard, that you cannot solve the issue of how to incorporate ICTs into human rights education in a couple of days. Of course you can't, but you don't need 2 years either, right? So my answer to that is, well, probably not 2 days, and that's why there's a follow-up process, but why 2 years, right? When there are other sectors that are going through quicker transformations, and again, this is my own bias, but coming from that reading of the context, that the context and the world outside the context in which we live is changing a lot faster than it used to. It's a much more complex world, a much more interconnected world, and a much more interdisciplinary world. And so my answer to that potential criticism that was voiced in that particular lab is that, well, that defensiveness might work against the very cause that we're trying to defend, which needs us to be more effective and more impactful. And the second line of resistance has to do with the size and the complexity of the problems, right? One very eloquent participant in that lab said, well, we're confronting capitalism. We're confronting inequality. How do you expect to, can you do a lab against that? Yeah, I say, well, we can start with this if you help us get through this in these 2 days. But he had a very good point that actually made us rethink the first step in the lab methodology. This is why actually partly why we incorporated after that lab this idea of whenever useful and possible. This is the thing with flash presentations that you have to go through all the animations again to get to the point. Well, the bubbles and all that, but I want to just show you this, the big picture, right? I don't know how many of you are familiar with the now defunct organization called International Council on Human Rights Policy. It used to be based in Geneva, which provided this kind of collective good for the human rights world, which is to think big, right? And to bring together like scholars, top scholars from around the world to think about climate change. And they produced the first book that I know of on climate change and human rights, but not 2 years ago. Everyone's producing that 2 years ago, but 15 years ago, right? So that's big thinking, but our own addition to that is, well, one part of the big picture and the big picture thinking has to be to deconstruct that huge problem into problems that can be at least addressed collectively in a much faster way, right? So this is why we call this decomposing structural dilemmas into dilemmas that might be amenable to a lab methodology or to any other methodology that can get people to collaborate more quickly on finding solutions and potential solutions. And third, resistance to experimentation, right? This is all very experimental, right? So you have to be ready to fail early. And there are all kinds of resistance against that. Funders don't like that. We don't like that. We don't like to say, well, we tried, but we failed. And that doesn't look good on the reports, doesn't look good on the web pages and all that. But that's key, and that's been embraced by other fields that have done it very well. And finally, the existential dilemma. Of course, I don't have a good answer for that, partly because that's the way I see it, and I was trained as a sociologist as a personal reflection of structural forces. Talk about the structural forces in all these institutions. Universities haven't changed in 100 years or so, right? Basically, the way in which we teach in universities with important innovations and additions hasn't changed much in a long time. And the institutional incentives are stronger in fields and in academic fields, in contexts that are stronger, like the US, because the push towards specialization is harder. It's a lot, quite frankly, it's a lot easier. It's not easy, but it's a lot less challenging to do this outside of the US. So it's a lot easier to do it in Latin America or in Africa or in Turkey than to do it here, because the academic fields and the NGO fields are not as regimented, as institutionalized, as highly specialized. But I'll say something about, we can talk more tomorrow about this, but about sequence. Sequence sounds like a sensible approach, right? You first do your academic training, you get tenure, and then you are in a position to do your activism. That's too late. Michael Boravoy has the same, one of my favorite sociologists and mentors. He has a wonderful article that's called In Defense of Public Sociology. And he's a professional sociologist. And he's trained some of the best sociologists in the world. He was, as I said, he was the president of the ISA, International Sociological Association, until last year. And he said, well, once you've been in grad school for 7 years, right, then you add another 7 years, while you look for tenure, you try to get tenure. Well, after 15 years, that's what you do. That's who you are. And that's why I feel, as you can tell, strongly about this, about incorporating spaces within those long 15 years that allow you to keep close to the ground, right? To do your activism or to do a research project, dissertation project that has some activist component to it. Because otherwise, well, you're re-socialized. If you're a social scientist, you know what socialization is. You are re-socialized. That's how, it's So it's a sociological way to put a very simple process in which you begin to think differently and to align your interests and your efforts in a different direction. And that's why I believe that creating those spaces, I just mentioned some potential mechanisms, that there are many others. I'm sure that many other people here are trying other mechanisms that we haven't thought of. But the crucial thing is that those spaces exist and be created so that people don't have to choose one thing or another if they don't want to. Yeah.
It's something of a false dichotomy. I mean, I've never reacted to a manuscript that's come in and somehow said, well, we're not going to publish this because it's dealing, you know, it's too actively addressing a current issue or something like that. And, you know, as I'm thinking with respect to the publications, we're multidisciplinary, so we get a bunch of things, but certainly in making the decisions, yeah, it's wonderful to see scholars that are addressing issues that are of importance, that are going to change people's lives. So it doesn't seem to me that the subject matter is something that should turn away scholars from the kind of action research that would be represented by human rights. And I would have thought that, at least in the human rights field, almost by definition, that most of the issues that people are going to be dealing with are of a certain currency. So, trying to end on a more optimistic note for you.
Any other question or reaction? Yeah. Final one, and then we'll wrap it up here. Yeah.
My question would be, as someone who's not in academia, what are the other paths aside from thinking about tenure track or something to be into this world? Are there other avenues you can go that don't require you getting crippling debt over a certain course of study, that you can still be in this world and be a very vital part of it? I say this as a BA political science graduate and didn't go any further than that, but managed to be gainfully employed for 30 years. So I'm just wondering about that, because it seems like everyone seems pretty set on one path. And do you see other paths out there?
Mm-hmm. Thanks.
Is this?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, now it's working. Yeah, I'm an amphibian. In the 80s, I was a high-ranking political party activist in Eugene, Oregon. And I hit on some research that was fantastic. I couldn't believe it at first. And a couple of years later, I realized there was some reason it wasn't going anywhere. And I became an academician. I taught at a college. It took me 2 years to get the right doctorate because I couldn't teach in economics that military spending is the principal cause of negative economic growth. I couldn't get by with that, and the finding was that the correlations were unbelievably accurate, 997 and so forth, that no one in the social sciences could believe it. But I had my initial training in engineering, and I knew what a physical science looked like. And a high correlation would be believable in the physical sciences. So I persisted. And it's taken me 30 years. And I've started blogging the last 2 years and getting 50,000 responses. And after 2 months, or about three months of blogging, I had almost everybody in the Peace and Justice Studies Association in the leadership trying to get me to stop. But I persisted, and I could tell by my academia results that a lot of them were listening, that I may have had 10,000 readings of my stuff because I had 1,000 that went for the kicker at the bottom for deeper reading. And the ratio is about 10%, I've discovered by other methods. So I am an amphibian, and I've gone from activist to academic to moving back into activist world to get my new paradigm of empire destroying America explained to people.
Thank you. Well, if this helps amphibians come out, I'll be happy with that outcome of these presentations. Just a quick couple of comments. I also, thanks Bert for the comment. I also am an optimist, and I see more and more spaces being carved out, still exceptional, still the minority, but certainly the fact that we're all here, certainly this center is one example. Efforts by your journal, efforts by other new outlets like Open Global Rights that open spaces for people to quickly write a quality piece, but shorter for discussion within the human rights field. Journals like SUR, produced in São Paulo in 3 languages, Portuguese, Spanish, and English. That also pointed in the direction of a much more cosmopolitan, multilingual discussion on human rights. And I think that those efforts are multiplying apace. But it'll take, and to go to your question, as I said, this is just a small sample of possible experiences and pilot projects that we have been, and I have been involved in, but certainly there are many others. These are other paths, and there are paths that are being created within academia, and those like the ones that I just mentioned, but there's also interesting efforts going on, very interesting efforts going on inside human rights organizations. For example, some organizations in Latin America are partnering with universities to create master's programs. This is just one more mainstream initiative, but I think it's quite promising, in which both the instructors and the students come from those 2 settings, right? So I agree that there's more experimentation and there's more diversity and paths being tried out, but still, I would the structures of both the strategies and the modus operandi, both in academia and in activist circles, are pretty well established. Although, and I'll end with this, the fact that there is, again, uncertainty, confusion, might bode well for experimentation to an extent that we haven't been taking advantage of. And finally, I put, again, my activist hat. We activists have been less daring and less experimental that we should have, or what we should be doing, given that our core set of values is pretty I wouldn't say countercultural, because that's from the 1960s, but way back, but pretty contrarian, right? So we're arguing against the structures, we're arguing against the ways of doing things that we criticize because of the values. What I would be very pleased to see would be to turn that criticism inwards and try to bring that spirit of experimentation and the spirit of criticism to the ways that we've been doing things, so that we can hopefully be more impactful in our own work. I'll end with that because it's quite late and we've run over, but thanks so much for your attention and your comments.
I'm not going to try to say anything very, very clever following that, other than to thank him. That was very good. You know, we're trying to create a center here that's amphibious in that sense, and many of the things to point to we have serious problems, and they're administrative problems. Just to give one example, we're doing a major applied research project, I guess you call it action research, and the faculty both at this university and other universities who are involved, have had to sign waivers that they cannot publish. They can't even acknowledge that they were on the working group doing this because of the sensitive nature of some of the material. And that's a very difficult thing to do. And as we create this Human Rights Center and try to bring faculty into it, we're just discovering, just on a simple mundane administrative thing, we can't figure out how to pay people. Do I work for political science? Do I work for a Human Rights Center? And so this is all trying to create an amphibious thing. So wonderful things. It's an affirmation of what we're trying to do, so thank you, but that has left me some very disturbing questions we'll go through the next 2 days. What's the role of a U.S. institution of higher education when the energy is shifted to the global south? I mean, I can get through in some Spanish, but what's our role? We'll try to answer that tomorrow. Thank you, everybody. We got a long day ahead.